kasih ya Tuhan atas penyertaan Kau dalam hidup kami.
Oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are King over the floods. I will be still, know you are God. Find rest, my soul, in Christ alone. Know His power in quietness and trust. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are King over the floods. I will be still, know you are God. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are King over the floods. I will be still, know you are God. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. We believe you alone are God. You alone are our Savior. Find rest, my soul, in Christ alone. Know His power in quietness and trust. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are King over the floods. I will be still, know you are God. When the oceans rise and thunders roar, I will soar with you above the storm. Father, you are King over the floods. I will be still, know you are God. I will be still, know you are God. I will be still, know you are God. Thank you, Jesus.
So I'm looking at Matthew 17, starting with the 14th verse. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. You know, I think sometimes we get so used to people kneeling before Jesus, it just seems, well, of course you kneel before Jesus, that you forget about what a striking thing that is for somebody to come up and kneel out in the open. Imagine seeing this on Pitt Street Mall. You see some people walking through in the crowd, and somebody comes up to somebody else, and they're on their knees before someone. What are you thinking? You're thinking, this is weird. This is weird. Yeah. But this is what happens to Jesus. And so this man, he comes up to Jesus, and he knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. Can you hear the aching pain here of a father for his son? Of a parent for his child. He's just desperate. He's on his knees before Jesus. Help my son. Help him. He says, I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him. And listen to Jesus' response. Those of you who aren't reading ahead in your Bibles, anyone want to guess what his response would be? I guess if we were to guess, we would guess,
Your faith has hit him.
Oh, you're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead. No, you're jumping ahead. Actually, Jesus' response is, you'd think that Jesus, if you think about Jesus, the mild, meek teacher on the Sunday school wall, with the white robe and the sandals and, the smile on his face, maybe a lamb over his shoe. You'd think that's going to be, no, his response is pretty harsh. You unbelieving and perverse generation. Whoa. See, he's not talking to the man on his knees. He's talking to the crowd who were looking on, curious. What's that about? You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you? He says. How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. Jesus is having a dummy spit here. He's had it. You know why? Because all those people have made a deal with the as-is world. Yes, it's a shame the boy falls into the fire. What are you going to do? Oh, it must be tough to be his dad. It's rough. That must be hard for you. And they keep their distance. Jesus is angry that people are putting up with this. And he's saying, how much longer must I put up with you who put up with this? We say, well, it's just the way it is. Bring the boy to me. Then the disciples, then Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. Then the disciples said to him in private. See, they didn't say this in public. It says after the crowds went away, they said in private, why couldn't we do it? Do you remember the father, he'd come to the disciples. They could do nothing. He said, why couldn't we do it? And Jesus replied, because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, a tiny little seed, you could say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. And nothing will be impossible for you. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I don't hear a lot of thanks be to God. Yeah, that's the word of the Lord. Wow. So, in the ancient world, a mountain was seen as an insurmountable barrier. If you're on a journey, you come up against a mountain, that's it. You're not going forward. You get three choices. You can turn left, you can turn right, or you can turn back, but you're not going forward. That's just the way it is. Mountains are mountains. They're insurmountable barriers. It's just not a practical option to go forward. I think over these past few years, I think most of us have faced times when we have come up against overwhelming barriers. I know in sharing in pastoral conversations with many of you, you've shared some pretty overwhelming barriers that you've come up against with your health, your families, with your work, with just trying to figure out how you're going to get through the day. Barriers that seem so overwhelming that we feel like we just can't possibly go forward. There are times like we see in this text in Matthew 17 for this father and for the disciples. This man, he approaches the disciples for help with and they can't do anything to help the son. So he asks Jesus for help. Jesus heals the boy, and then you got these disciples. Well, what's going on? And Jesus tells them. Remember what he said. Truly I tell you, if you had faith as small as a mustard seed, you could say to the mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. Let me ask you, as you gather here for City Heart, how many of you believe nothing will be impossible for you? How many of you believe that Jesus is saying that to you? Nothing will be impossible for you. I saw in this whole room, I saw one hand. I'm not gonna dob the person in, but it was one hand. Can I confess that it's hard for me to believe this? You know, what Jesus is talking about here is that not that nothing will be impossible for you and that you're going to have magic powers or that you're going to be like Superman. That's not what Jesus is saying. Nothing will be impossible for you where God has put a call on your life, where God has sent you in mission. Nothing will be impossible for you. So remember the context here. It's this boy who is suffering, and his father who's suffering with his boy, and nobody can help. And Jesus says, nothing will be impossible for you. In addressing this as-is world, nothing will be impossible for you. This faith that Jesus is talking about when he talks about moving mountains, he's not talking about telekinesis. You know what telekinesis is? If I just concentrate enough, I can move that mountain. If I just believe, sometimes you even hear Christians talk about it like this, that if I just say the right words and I don't have any doubt, I can make anything happen. I can move this pulpit. That's not what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about that kind of belief. He's talking about relational faith. It's not a set of concepts. It's not a set of doctrines. It's not a concentration of your mind. It's not an ideology. It is a relationship. Remember how we started in relationship with God in prayer? It's a relationship. If you have just a little bit of that relationship, nothing will be impossible for you because nothing is impossible for God. If God is doing it, it's not going to be impossible. If you're doing something contrary to what God is doing, yeah, of course it's going to be impossible. But if you have faith just the size of a mustard seed, you're going to be able to move mountains. That relational faith, that trust, that's what Jesus is talking about. When we run up against a mountainous barrier blocking the path that God is leading us on, that relational faith says that we're going to keep moving forward. Regardless of what it looks like to us, we're going to keep moving forward because we trust that our living God will never lead us to a dead end. Tell your neighbor, our living God will never lead us to a dead end. Go ahead and tell your neighbor that. So you're not going to remember it from me, but they'll remember it from me. Go ahead. Our living God will never lead us to a dead end. All right. How many feel really awkward now? Okay, that's good. But maybe you'll remember that our living God will never lead us to a dead end. That relational trust tells us that we are moving on. You know, they have a saying in the African American church: if God has brought us to it, God will bring us through it. You ever hear that? If God has brought us to it, God will bring us through it. And you know, our sisters and brothers in the African American church, they know a little something about facing mountainous barriers. If God has brought us to it, God will bring us through it, has given them the courage to stand before towering barriers. Slavery, segregation, racism, injustice. And to say again and again and again, mountain, get out of the way. The Lord is leading us on. Now, I had an extraordinary experience about 30 years ago, part of an urban ministry program when I was in theological college. And as part of that program, I spent about 6 hours one night with an African American congregation in the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. Kensington is known, it's not like Kensington in London. Kensington, Philadelphia is known as the roughest, hardest neighborhood in Philadelphia, one of the toughest, roughest neighborhoods on the east coast of the U.S. It's known for its drugs, for its poverty, and for its violence. I shared this experience with an online devotion with our Wesley mission staff last month. And a young woman who serves in our escaping violence work, she came up to me in the hall on level 3 the next day. She said, I'm not religious. But she was in the devotion. She said, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, I think. But that story you told about Philadelphia, that's why I work for Wesley Mission. I thought, well, that's about as good as I can hope for from any devotion, when somebody connects that story in with their life. But there was more. It was a couple of weeks after that that a member of this congregation, somebody who's sitting right in this room, and I have not asked the person for permission, so I'm not going to embarrass that person, but somebody in this room right now heard me tell this story 7 years ago. It was their first time that they'd ever been in church at Wesley Mission. And they heard me tell this story, and they told me the story in detail. Now, as a preacher, can I tell you, if somebody remembers anything I said on Tuesday that I said on Sunday, I count that as a win. 7 years, somebody was able to tell me the story. I said, yeah, that's the story. And just out of the blue, I had just told this story for the first time in ages. I told it in the devotion, and then I get it told to me here in this room, which is astonishing. And then there's more. A couple of weeks after that, we had a group in here, just next door, a group from Melbourne called Surrender. It's a group of Christians who are part of a movement about addressing poverty and injustice as Christians with the gospel. What is Jesus leading us to as disciples? So there's this really weird mix of people. There were people from Wesley Mission. There were people from this group called Street Level, a ministry called Street Level. There were bikers in there, motorcycle with all the leather and everything like that, and then there were Uniting Church people, and there were Salvos, and there were Churches of Christ people from all over. You said, what is it that would bring these people together? This sense of calling to discipleship, about this as is world is not as God intends it. And he is enlisting us as disciples to do something about it. And so we're in that group, and I met a guy there, an Aussie. His name was Cause. And I met him, it's just in that time, like when we're having tea, our morning tea, we're just gathering. And when you're in a group of mostly strangers, that awkward time where, who am I going to talk to? And you end up having a talk with a stranger, and they just start talking about what, and he heard my accent. So of course that's always we can talk about that. And I told him where I was from, and it turns out he had lived for 15 years in America. You know where? Anyone want to guess where? In Kensington. He must be the only Australian who lives in Kensington. But he did ministry in Kensington for 15 years. He knows this church. He knows this neighborhood. He knows the story, the people. What are the chances that this story should emerge and then I'd meet somebody who knows a story I've never met? So I want to share this experience with you today because it just won't leave me alone. 30 years later, it's still confronting me, it's challenging me, it's changing me. And it's helping me to see Jesus at work. And it's helping me to discover my place in Jesus' work. And I hope that it does that for you and for us as I share it this afternoon. When I said Kensington is known as the roughest part of Philly, that's how outsiders see it. Outsiders know it for its poverty, for its drug dealers, for its violent crime. But I had the privilege of spending 6 hours with a congregation of people about the size of this congregation who knew it as something else. They knew Kensington as home. And I had a chance to be with them on that night as they gathered at church to pray for their neighborhood. The pastor opened with prayer, and others joined in, much like we do. I remember particularly one woman who was praying for her son who had gotten involved in a gang. And she prayed, and others prayed with her. They prayed for protection. They prayed for grace. They prayed for deliverance. Their prayers were heartfelt and fervent. And then they sang. We were talking earlier about hearing each other sing. 50 people in that room sounded like 500. It was just amazing to hear them sing old gospel hymns. And they could really sing as a congregation. And then the pastor at the end of the service, the pastor spoke his sending out to the congregation. You know the sending out at the end? I heard a lot of sending out because I grew up in the church. And so I know what the sending out means. The sending out is the time when church is almost over. Sometimes blessedly, almost over. Okay, I can get on with my day. So the sending out is kind of nice words the minister says to draw the service to a close. But there's something different about this sending out that I was hearing from the pastor in that church in Kensington. It was so different that it kind of it was a bit unsettling for me. It was unsettling because I had felt very comfortable up to this point. I felt very comfortable with all the prayers, the wonderful music. I felt very comfortable. It was a little different than what I'd grown up with, but I was at home with it. It felt very comfortable for me. But this sending started to displace me a little bit. As the pastor sent out his congregation, it struck me that this didn't sound like the end of church. This sounded like the very beginning. Like church was just getting started. I was listening to his voice. It had a spiritual gravity to it. It had an emotional intensity to it. And as he started to wrap up, it struck me there was something else different about this sending out that the pastor was doing. He was actually sending us. It wasn't just a sending out. He was literally sending us. I don't mean to sending us out to go have a nice think about what we've just heard about and just chew some food for thought. No, he was sending us out to live what we had just read and prayed and heard and sung about. The worship and the service, the word and the deed, the spiritual and the practical were woven together in the pastor sending out. Sister Claudia has some extra flashlights if anyone needs one tonight. And Brother Raymond is going to be on the walkie-talkie in case there's any trouble. Trouble? Well, when have you heard that in a pastor sending out, in case there's any trouble? I'd never heard that in the pastor sending out. Brother Raymond is going to be on the walkie-talkie in case there's any trouble. To which everyone but me was saying, amen, that's right, praise Jesus. And I was like, trouble? Those words of sending out, they were an actual sending. A literal sending. And then the congregation was moving right from word into deed. And the next thing I knew, I'm standing on a street corner facing a dilapidated, abandoned house, all boarded up and covered with graffiti, with about 50 black people that I'd never met before that night at 9 o'clock on a chilly autumn night in the most crime-ridden neighborhood in Philadelphia. Can I tell you that I was out of my comfort zone? I'll confess to you, I felt very comfortable when we were in the church building. I felt very safe, very secure in the sanctuary of the church building. But when the church moved out of the building onto the street corner, I was way out of my comfort zone. And the pastor came alongside me. I think that he could see in my face the anxiety that I was trying to hide. And he said, "You're going to be all right, young man. The Lord is standing with us tonight." And then he explained what we were doing out there on that street corner. He told me that the dealers used to own this corner until a few weeks prior, when the people of his church and other churches in the neighborhood decided they were taking it back in the name of the Lord. And so they started standing out on that street corner on weekend nights. That's what we were doing out on the street corner that night. That's why Brother Raymond had the walkie-talkie. That's why Sister Claudia had the extra flashlights. He said, the Lord has called us the light of the world, and we're not going to give the devil any shadows to work on in this corner. Before long, a nice car with New Jersey plates came slowly rolling up to the corner. New Jersey is just over the border from Philadelphia, and this car came rolling up, and it had 4 white kids in it. And they came rolling up. It was explained to me that kids from the suburbs would drive into the neighborhood to buy drugs and then take them back to the suburbs. Because from their perspective, why else would anyone go to Kensington? Right? A young man from the congregation approached the car, and he put his hand on the roof, and he leaned down to the window, and he started praying for its occupants. And soon a couple older men, like the age of his father, came up, and they were praying with him. And then there was an elderly woman who was standing reading the Psalms. And there was a woman on the curb who was the woman who prayed for her son in the gang. And she stood there and she said, "Go home now, children. The drugstore is closed tonight." It was an astonishing scene. And if you could have seen the bewildered look on those kids' faces. Because, when they got in the car that night, they were going to buy drugs. That's what they thought they were going to. They had no idea that they were driving to church. We saw that scene repeated over and over through the night. Which would be another car would roll up of bewildered, startled, astonished-looking white kids, and there'd be more prayers, and there'd be more psalms, and there'd be more sermons, and then they'd drive away, wondering what just hit them. But the drugstore was closed tonight. And when there was a break in the between the cars, when there was a longer break, someone would start singing an old gospel hymn. And everyone sang in. Everyone joined in. They all knew the words. And they filled that neighborhood with praise. There was no missing that they were there. I stood out there for a few hours with that congregation until my ride came to pick me up around midnight. I have to tell you that even with the pastor's confident assurance and with all these nice church people around me, I never felt completely safe and comfortable on that street corner that night. It occurred to me that standing out there where the drug dealers did their work was probably going to make the drug dealers pretty cross. And they might just be over in that corner over there or over in that building over there. But what really struck me as I got into my ride and drove away, all the congregation were still out there. And they were still singing and still praying, still being the light of the world. And I knew that when those people finally left to go home, they weren't being driven away by a ride. They were going home right there in that neighborhood. Right there in that neighborhood that they so loved. That God so loved. Yeah, I didn't see any roadside conversions that night. I tell you what I did see. I saw a congregation moving mountains by faith. And my few hours in that congregation has stayed with me, unsettling my spirit ever since. Jesus leads us on a journey. Do you hear what Jesus is doing? Do you hear what Jesus is doing in this story with the young man and with the father and the son who needs help? Do you hear what Jesus is doing with this congregation in the midst of the city of Philadelphia? Do you hear what God is doing in your life, in your family, in this church, in this mission? Do you hear what he's doing in Sydney? In his so loved world, do you hear it? Jesus, when he begins his ministry, he doesn't call disciples to settle in to the as-is world, or to have a little spiritual accessory to the as-is world. He doesn't say, hey, we've got a lovely building here in Capernaum. Why don't we have we'll have church on Sunday, and I'll preach a sermon. Nobody's going to preach like Jesus, right? I'll preach a sermon, and we'll run some programs, and it'll be good for the kids. And you'll get some interesting food for thought, and we'll do some reading of the scriptures, and we'll sing some songs, and that'll be your discipleship. He doesn't do that. What does he do? What does he do? From day one, he leads his disciples on a mission to transform the as-is world. He sends them out into villages. He leads them to follow me into villages and towns and cities to transform the as-is world. He shows them the brokenness, the injustice of the world. He brings them into contact with people that they never could imagine being in contact with, much less being family with. He shows them the world, and he says, this is not how God intends it, and you're going to be part of changing that by grace, by faith. He sends them out into the world trusting in God, trusting in God, trusting that God, who has brought them to it, is going to bring them through it. And so it is with us, Wesley City Heart. You know, our city has its share of mountainous barriers. Would you agree? Maybe you face them. Maybe you know others who have faced them. I just want to share with you just one as I close. A week before last, Wesley Mission, we held our Wesley Life Force Suicide Memorial Service. That's a really important thing that we do. And if you have a lived experience of suicide, you know the grief like no other. Suicide is a complex issue. There's so many of the things that we are engaged in as a mission collide in a person's life that can lead them to see no alternative but to take their life. And at there's a lot of upstream work we do as well, crisis intervention. We have a member of this congregation who has just been accepted for training as a Lifeline volunteer. It's a huge, huge, huge thing. And postvention, there's another member of this congregation who was there at that service, listening to people's stories, sharing that time with them, bearing that pain with them, offering prayer where they welcomed it. There's more that we can do as a mission, and there's more that we are doing. Can I just share with you a little bit? We have Wesley Life Force networks all around this country. And they're not programs that we run. They're communities that we resource to in their own context, in their own place, in their own culture, to address the hopelessness and that leads to people to end their lives. And it is amazing what's happening with these networks. Do you know how many networks do we have? 134. She's got the number right on. It's 134 networks all across Australia, and these networks help to empower people in their own context to change the dynamic in their own community. We had a research that was done by the University of Melbourne. They don't work for, they're not a Christian university, in case you're wondering. They were just doing proper research to see how these life force networks are impacting the communities where they're established. And their research showed that within 12 months, of a Wesley Life Force network being established in the community, the suicide rate drops by 17% within 12 months. And that's not just a statistic. That is people's lives. That is families being changed. That's communities finding hope, being empowered. That's life. And there's another story that I want to share with you at another time. I just want to give you a glimpse of what's possible here. There's a community in the Northern Territory that was not too long ago had the highest rate of suicide on the planet. The highest rate of suicide anywhere in the world. A Wesley Life Force network was established in that community. And there were people in that community, particularly a couple of aunties, who just loved their community. And when they were equipped in their own culture to be able to address this despair, they went out listening for trouble. They went out on the streets listening for trouble in their community. And where they found it, they brought care, they brought love, they brought hope, they brought connection. And you know what happened in that community? The suicide rate that was the highest in the world, you know how much it dropped to? 0. Do you believe we can move mountains? If God has brought us to it, God will bring us through it. And we can face the injustice that we face in our own lives. We can face the injustice and the pain and the hardship we face in our families, that we see on the streets, that we experience in this city, that we see in this country. We can address those if we are on board with what God is doing. If we're engaged in the mission of God, if we're not trying to remake church in our image, but we allow Him to remake us in His. The Lord has prepared us for our mission to transform the as-is world, walking in the way of Jesus. On our own, let me assure you, on our own, it is way too much. And if we're finding it to be overwhelming, if we're finding it to be way too much, it's because we're facing it on our own. But with God, nothing will be impossible for you. Those are the final words of my sermon. I just want to let them rest in. It's not for the person next to you. That's who you think it's for. But I'm actually speaking directly to you now. Nothing will be impossible for you. I'm going to leave you with these words because they're not my words. They're Jesus' words. Nothing will be impossible for you. With God, nothing will be impossible for you. By His grace. Amen.
Mercy never fails me. All my days I've been held in your hands. From the moment that I wake up until I lay my head, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. And all my I've known the loss of rain, and I have lived in the goodness of God. Yeah. And all my life you have been faithful. And all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I will sing of the goodness of God. Yeah, 'cause your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, surrendered now, I give you everything. 'Cause your goodness is running after, it's running after me. Oh, your goodness is running after, it's running after me. 'Cause your goodness is running after, it's running after me. With my life laid down, surrendered now, I give you everything. 'Cause your goodness is running after, it's running after me. And all my life you have been faithful. Oh, and all my life you have been so good. With every breath that I am able, oh, I'm gonna sing of the goodness of God.